In Powell, a moderately aged man describes the main episode of the series. He works as a police craftsman and is fairly disappointed with his family, and calling his researcher spouse Stephanie really buckles down for a huge logical organization called Worldwide Tech, as she's right now doing explore on a strange planet. Daphne and JJ, his two high school kids, are continually on their telephones. What's more, lack the capacity to deal with exercises like playing get with their dad. They're losing the ties that an ordinary family ought to have among themselves. Exhausted, Jim settles on the choice that they will all go with mother on her examination outing to Brazil, so they can all go through some family time together. Jim recommends that they take a trip over the Amazon rainforest. While they're voyaging, however, things don't work out as expected due to an moving toward storm. The plane compelled to land in the sea, which is to some degree sparkling with minuscule neon particles. Luckily, Jim's family is safe yet. Their pilot isn't all that fortunate. In the following scene, Jim and his family are back home, carrying on with their different existences once more. In the wake of getting back from the outing, Jim is back working at the area where he converses with a female criminal investigator analyst Cho about a case. As they're talking, a fellow in the station unexpectedly gets an official's firearm and focuses it at the analyst. Jim sees this and plunges to push her far removed, saving her. Anyway, the firearm actually goes off after a while. Analyst Cho gets up and ponders where the projectile is. Jim then pardons himself and searches in his grasp. There's the shot. Evidently he got the projectile with his own hand without getting hurt. Jim is stunned to fathom what simply happened. He then, at that point, goes to a batting enclosure to investigate what could have simply happened to him. He warns the security fellow and figures out how to have the entire spot for him for an hour, set the pitching machine to 90 miles each hour. He shockingly gets pitches without a issue. Then he speeds up to 140 miles each hour. Still no issue. Just then, at that point, his closest companion and partner, George, who is a lead prosecutor, shows up and Jim gives him a firearm. George isn't enthused about shooting Jim, yet he coincidentally discharged the weapon and Jim gets the slug. Again, the two of them are left in sheer doubt by what simply occurred. In the interim, Stephanie is in a difficulty. She needs to have a decent supper with Jim, yet work is requesting her consideration. She has to get across town for a work meeting. However, the traffic is exceptionally terrible. Having no other choice, she begins running, and this is the point at which she goes increasingly fast. She zooms past vehicles on the interstate and figures out how to get to the workplace on time. It seems like Stephanie has additionally gotten a few new capacities back at the lab. She enlightens her lab tech Katie, and they go to an ice horsing track to test her capacities, while Stephanie starts to run on the track. Katie, with a radar firearm, peruses that Stephanie's speed is in the walloping 700-mile-each-hour range. With her freshly discovered capacity, Stephanie hurries back home to assist her child JJ with schoolwork, as he has a learning handicap. Meanwhile, Jim and George show up at a house stop. George is persuaded that Jim has one more superpower too, that he can fly. Jim is suspicious, yet yields. Furthermore, leaps off the roof. Tragically, his hunch ends up being valid, and he drops to the ground, making a gigantic pit in it. When he gets up, he takes a gander at the highest point of the structure and jumps back to the rooftop. This makes Jim understand that despite the fact that he can't fly, he can jump like an insane hero. As the two men return to their vehicle, their police scanner pops. It just so happens a person who's been burglarizing adornment stores is being sought after. Midtown. Jim starts to jump. That way he winds up getting the person in a rear entryway. However, previously he can stifle him. The miscreant's accomplice out of nowhere shoots him toward the rear of the head. Jim hauls the shot out of his head, yet he is draining prior to falling. Oblivious, he considers George for help. The following morning, Jim awakens in bed to track down George and Stephanie before him. Stephanie asks him what wrong is, and Jim at last tells her. Going on stunned, she additionally tells her spouse that she's obtained godlike drives. In the interim, their little girl Daphne is having sweetheart difficulty at school. The class Beatrice Sarah is hitting on him. Stressed, she converses with her companion Lindsay about it later as Daphne plays in her ball game. She begins to hear everybody's contemplations. Monstrosities her out, so she calls her folks to get her from school. Daphne then, at that point, informs her mother regarding her having the option to guess individuals' thoughts. This makes Stephanie understand that even her girl has acquired some sort of capacity. Slice to the next scene. The Powells require a family meeting. They discover that everybody has some sort of force with the exception of poor JJ. The following day anyway, while JJ is taking a numerical test, things begin to sparkle on the board and the solutions for the test show up directly before him. He grins. Also, rapidly gets everything on paper. Somewhere else, Daphne meets her sweetheart and, as they kiss, she can peruse his contemplations. She tragically discovers that he's laying down with her closest companion, Lindsay. She surges out, leaving him uncertain how she knew that he was undermining her. Working, Jim draws a image of the gem hoodlum in light of the battle with him in the rear entryway. He then runs the image through facial acknowledgement. Furthermore, figures out how to get an ID in light of his data analyst Cho and her partner plan to find the cheat before they leave the area. They advise Jim to remain behind since he's simply a craftsman and not a wrongdoing contender. At the point when the analysts appear at the hoodlum's loft, a shootout results and analyst Cho winds up in the storage compartment of his vehicle right when the criminal is going to drive off. Jim shows up there. They start to battle, yet this time the gem cheat is prepared for him. Jim strikes at him, however the cheat shockingly evaporates and returns in the back. The cheat then lets Jim know that he's not alone. Who has superpowers? They proceed battling, with Jim always being unable to land a perfect punch on the troublemaker. This is until the hoodlum winds up behind Jim with a weapon pointed at his neck. Out of nowhere, a shot rings out. Fortunately, it's from criminal investigator Cho. It just so happens she figured out how to step out of the storage compartment and shoot the miscreant. It's uncovered that she didn't see Jim's superpower, so she tells him to leave before interior issues begins posing inquiries. Subsequently, the scene movements to a mortuary where a puzzling man who shockingly turns out to be Stephanie, his manager from Worldwide Tech, lets his partner Morgan know that they ought to kill the individual behind the hoodlum's demise. The next day, Jim keeps on attempting to battle wrongdoing by jumping to a bank theft. He winds up in a rear entryway with the looters driving a van straight for him. He then, at that point, chooses to stop. The van, however, gets run over. All things considered, interim Stephanie and her lab colleague Katie work on getting a water test from the Amazon waterway where the plane crash happens. Stephanie imagines that the water has something to do with her and her family's superpower. Once back at home, Stephanie begins doing house tasks on super speed. She then accepts she has time for everything. In the meantime, her child JJ begins improving on his tests in light of the fact that, very much like his family, he presently has a super mental ability. One day in the library, Daphne hears her sibling learning complex geometry hypotheses. She is amazed to see him there as he was never into. Concentrates on JJ. At long last opens up to educate her concerning his power. However, he does admit that he hasn't told their guardians since they were so pleased with him after he excelled on the tests. Feeling awful, Daphne says she'll keep his secret. Later, after the ringer rings, JJ's educator blames him for undermining the last couple of tests in light of the fact that the youngster generally flopped on his numerical tests. However, presently he's getting straight A's. Accordingly, JJJ blows him away with some perplexing math talk. However, his instructor actually needs to talk to his folks about his cheating. Subsequently, Jim converses with JJ about the tests. Tragically, JJ gets the feeling that his father believes he's cheating as well and stomps off. The next day, Morgan, the man from the mortuary who was companions with the now dead cheat, comes into the police station and converses with investigator Cho Hee, inquires as to whether she saw anything odd. Or on the other hand, surprising about the bank looter she shot last week. The investigator takes note. Something is off with the person, so she says she saw nothing strange in the interim. George is doing some police work with a sketch that Jim had drawn of the bank looters. He then, at that point, goes to a bank. He accepts the cheat, will focus straight away. While George is showing the sketch to a few monitors, the burglars appear. With their weapons, George stows away and calls Jim in spite of the fact that he figures out how to let his companion have some familiarity with the burglary. He is gotten by the burglars and pushed into their van. Fortunately, Jim shows up at the scene at the last possible second. At first, he gets run over, however, at that point recovers his self-control, gets the van and tosses it over. Jim then, at that point, helps George out of the van. Similarly, as criminal investigator Cho appears at seek after the looters, she is as yet confused about his power slice. To the following scene, Stephanie and Katie concentrate on the water. They figured out how to recover from the Amazon. Much amazingly, they understand there's nothing all that amazing about it, driving them to can't help thinking about what could really be the source of their powers. In the interim, analyst Cho returns home to her loft and Morgan is there sitting tight for her. It turns out he has supernatural power and uses it to gag her. He asks her or who else knows that the bank looter she shot last week had powers. Joe says she doesn't have the foggiest idea anything about it. Morgan lets her fall to the floor, however drives her to point her own firearm towards her. Cho begins to crack out, and as Morgan escapes the condo, a gunfire is heard, evidently killing the criminal investigator. He then calls Stephanie's supervisor at Worldwide Tech, telling him that everything is dealt with. Cut to the following scene, the Powells go to a companion's wedding. Anyway, a lot of looters crash the wedding, inquiring everybody to place their gems in a case. The cheats additionally take Stephanie's wedding band. However, the Powells choose not to utilize their superpower to get back at the looters, understanding that they would be putting their lives in extreme danger the following day. Stephanie figures out how to get the financing for her examination at Worldwide Tech. However, her chief tells her that as a feature of the subsidizing, they need to test her blood test for protection purposes. The organization as of now has her example, as it was required some investment prior for a comparative task, understanding that her chief and the others would figure it out about her superpower once the blood is tried. Stephanie concocts an arrangement to switch her blood test with Katie's. Next scene, Daphne and her father Jim talk about how things are going. All of a sudden he gets a call from George about another wedding that is probably going to be looted. Subsequently, Jim deceives her that he has some crisis work at the region. Anyway, since Daphne can guess thoughts, she finds out about his lies that evening. Stephanie and Katie are at Worldwide Tech to switch a portion of Stephanie's blood tests. Katie has the course planned. Stephanie simply needs to break in without dialing back, or the cameras will see her. Moreover, she needs to swipe a vital card. At a certain point, she figures out how to do that and move beyond the watchman without being seen. She then, at that point, effectively swipes the blood tests. Meanwhile, George and Jim are at the wedding. All of a sudden, the looters appear and Jim attempts to curb them. During this time he has chance, however the projectiles don't chip away at him. The looters trust Jim to a cop wear a tactical armor carrier, so they attempt to get away. However, not before he punches one of them. Oblivious, the burglars and Jim all rush out past Daphne, who is at the scene to see what her father was doing. Evidently, her father is attempting to battle hoodlums, all without help from anyone else. When Jim sees that the looters are moving away through a rope, he jumps up on a structure and figures out how to get one of them by the leg. The burglar tumbles down onto a showing up cop vehicle, yet shockingly endures when Jim returns home. Stephanie and Daphne are pausing for him, furious about his lying. Evidently, they had guaranteed each other that they won't utilize their power until they truly understand what's befalling them. Jim Lets them know that his powers are at long last, allowing him to be the individual he needs to be. The next day at work, George tells Jim that they needed to relinquish the burglar rec center got yesterday since they have no proof anyway. George doesn't have Stephanie's ring, which was recuperated at the scene. Meanwhile, Worldwide Tech's manager brings in a worker, inquiring as to whether he was in the structure the other day, as his card was utilized to get to the lab. We understood that the card was taken by Stephanie to break in. However, the representative is ignorant regarding this. Later, the supervisor notices the CCTV film, however, doesn't see anybody anyway. He does notice Stephanie's blood vial quickly vanishing and showing up in the lab's cooler. Presently, the supervisor is dubious of Stephanie. That evening, Jim takes Stephanie to supper. On the top of an eatery they dance yet again together, and he proposes to her with her recuperated wedding band.